have the reflector oven in front of me. I'm just going to make a box cake. This one is a banana bread, so that's just the box cake by Betty Crocker. It calls for 1 banana. It calls for some cooking oil. I'm going to pump up the banana bread recipe by throwing in some molasses. And it requires water, and just happen to have some water here. Like normally I'm using pumped water, right, from a gravity filter or something. This recipe also calls for a couple of eggs, so I've got some eggs that I brought. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to mush up the banana so it's ready to add to the recipe when I put it in to the pan, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, but I want to get the banana ready. It needs to be nicely mushed up so that it mixes into the recipe. Okay. This is what you normally use, a round pan. You don't use a square pan, simply because you're going to get a more even bake in the reflector oven using a round pan. Another thing I learned along the way, I don't want to have to worry about cleaning the pan, so I use parchment paper. The parchment paper comes in rolls. I just take a nice sharp knife with a sharp tip and I cut the paper to fit into the pan. The nice thing about it is I can actually mix the recipe inside the parchment paper. Go ahead, cook it, and then afterwards, when we're ready to eat, I take the parchment paper off, I throw it in the fire, and I have the clean pan to put away. So. There we go. You can just put all the stuff in here. It definitely works best to add the water next, the egg and the oil last. This recipe calls for half a cup of water, and I don't have a cup here to measure, so I am gonna wing it a bit. Because the nice thing about this is you can kind of mix it to consistency. Here's about half a cup. There we go. Like I said, you can just do it all the mixing right inside the parchment paper. I suggest use a spoon. If you use a fork, especially if people are bringing metal forks on the trip, you could rip the parchment paper, and you don't want that. Some people, if you want, you can mix everything in a bowl, but then you got to clean the bowl. When you actually start cooking in the reflector oven, you have to rotate it inside the oven regularly, but 6 minutes works fine. And you use some sort of fire gloves because the pan is hot, right? And you basically, every 6 minutes, you rotate it 90 degrees, right? So obviously, what's that, 29, 6, 4, 6, 20, yeah, every 24 minutes it gets fully around. Yeah. So, okay, so it's a fairly bit wet. So why don't I add a couple of eggs and my 1/4 cup of oil. So watch me wing a 1/4 cup. I have one friend who I did a trip with who couldn't believe that I would not measure everything exactly. And I found that isn't that necessary. I probably will need a bit more oil than that. Oop. There's the piece of plastic. Okay, so one egg. If you have a whisk, you could get the eggs better prepared before you add them. I find that much fuss isn't necessary. I find with these recipes, it's like mixing concrete. You get familiar with what the consistency needs to be, and it's pretty wet actually. I'm going to add just a little more water to this. That's definitely, that should do it. Get my banana in. And like I said, I'm going to cheat a little because I want it to taste really yummy, the molasses. Or if I'm making an icing, sometimes I'll make it with limoncello or just concentrated lemon juice. And I mix it appropriately. I don't know if you can see it, but the molasses is already adding some nice brown swirls. I'll take the cake, put it inside, right? Position it in front. One key thing to know that it's cooking well is you put your hand in front, and literally, if you don't have to pull it back away within 5 seconds, if you don't have to do that, then it's not hot enough. Hot enough for now anyway. Okay, so I'm going to spin it now. Like I said, you only rotate it 90 degrees. This is looking quite warm now. I also find if you do get ashes on top, just blow them off. This rose very fast. It's looking incredibly perfectly browned.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's nice and hot. I'm going to check to see if it's cooked. You can often watch the front edge to see if it's browning too quickly. It's like anything. You're cooking it, and if it's black, it's getting too much heat. So I'm going to check now. God, it's hot here. This is telling me it's cooked already.